Author Jasper Craven is a Northeast Kingdom native who got his start in journalism at the Caledonian Record. He covers the military and veterans issues for outlets including the New York Times, Harper's, New Republic, The Nation, and New York Magazine. God Forgives, Brothers Don't was published on May 19, 2026. He is also the co-author of the academic book, Our Veterans. Jasper is the son, he told me I could say this, he is the son of Jay Craven and Bess O'Brien, both of whom have been leaders in our community in arts, culture, film, recovery, and other issues. So there's something in the water here in the NEK. On May 24th, the New York Times published Jasper's article about a 15-year-old's war museum in Danville, Vermont. And if you'd like a copy of that article, you can see me after. Jasper's topics touch us all. For example, my father was sent to West Point from Linden Institute in 1944. We are honored to have Jasper Craven with us tonight.
Thanks everybody for coming out, I appreciate it. There's no AC, there's a single fan, so I will try to move swiftly. I am going to start off and just read a short passage from the beginning of the book, and then move to a slightly lighter topic with this presentation, and then we can talk, I can answer questions, whatever works. In September 2025, I received word from a trusted source that Valley Forge Military Academy was closing after 98 years. The place had been founded by a lieutenant general on an old school promise, but one with seemingly endless appeal. Quote, "Send us your boy and we will return to you a man." Since the dawn of America, the military has articulated some version of this pledge, solidly staking its claim on the monumental work of building the American man. While the military's masculine archetype was formed inside the wire, it went mainstream long ago, evident by a dizzying array of cultural tokens, from war movies and toy soldiers to cargo pants, Boy Scouts, bodybuilding, and the Hummer. Military principles have infused countless parenting books and informed self-help gurus across the political spectrum. Conservative Missouri Senator Josh Hawley's 2023 book, Manhood, The Masculine Values America Needs, explicitly romanticizes the warrior archetype, arguing that, quote, "men are part of God's solution to danger in the world." Liberal Alpha Bro podcaster Scott Galloway similarly argues in his 2025 book, Notes on Being a Man, that proper masculinity involves, quote, "acting as if you are wearing military fatigues, recognizing that a core reason you are here is to protect yourself, your partner, your family, and your country." America is today in general agreement around certain precepts that all men should aspire to, among them strength, discipline, and self-sacrifice. On close inspection, however, it becomes abundantly clear that these traits are calibrated to enhance the aims of the military state, not the man. In truth, each tenet has nuggets worth living by. But as broadly interpreted today, these characteristics fuel stoicism, self-destructiveness, and nihilism, forming an outlook that is beneficial for cold battlefield environments, but not at all equipped to handle the emotional complexities of civilian life. John Wheeler, a 1966 West Point graduate, aptly articulated this corrosive worldview, explaining that his commitment to the Army revolved around his belief that there are, quote, "things worth dying for." This distinctly masculine outlook, Wheeler reasoned, inverts a more optimistic, feminine-coded belief that, quote, "there are things worth living for." I first heard about the Forge, as insiders call it, in late 2020, when a group of concerned parents reached out and told me the place was falling apart. Quote, "We the parents paid for a product, we were promised a product," Scott Newell, a former parent and alumnus, told me back then. and then they switched the product out and turned it into bullshit. For much of its history, the Forge resembled a patriotic paradise. Cadets ranging in age from 12 to 21 aimed to build their bodies and sharpen their minds on a verdant, 100-acre campus located on the outskirts of Philadelphia. Now, in Newell's eyes, the school was enabling the kind of masculine dysfunction it promised to prevent. Quote, "We have an entire generation in this country that has failed miserably at character and leadership and honor and integrity. And now I'm going to get choked up and cry," he said, not a lick of emotion tinging his voice, because that's all the stuff you learn at military academies like Valley Forge. When I first dug into the Forge, I discovered an acrid strain of masculinity that was raw, violent, fiercely hierarchical, and quickly mutating out of control. I uncovered stories of vicious beatings, brutal rapes, predatory grooming, and widespread racism and misogyny. I was told about incidents of waterboarding, whippings, brandings with scalding forks, forced piercings, even horse abuse. These boys of the Forge were hurting, but had only learned how to hurt. During the previous 4 academic years, local police had responded more than 300 times to incidents on campus, including for cadets as young as 13 experiencing psychiatric crises and demonstrating suicidal behavior. In the spring of 2016, a promising 18-year-old cadet named Kerry LeCamp killed himself in his dorm room. Most shocking, perhaps, was the behavior of the men in charge, who showed not only willful ignorance of this culture, but active complicity in it. They retaliated against boys who spoke out, fixed grades to burnish the school's reputation, and padded their own pockets. Some were also violent. In 2023, not long after my investigation into the Forge was published in Mother Jones, its board of trustees voted to funnel their dwindling resources and institutional energy not into addressing cadet abuse, but instead to build Crossed Sabers, a palatial farmhouse-style residence worth $1.7 million for Academy President Colonel Stuart Helgeson and his wife Stephanie to use free of charge. The board also hired Mrs. Helgeson, a former insurance executive, as the school's chief development officer. As a flurry of former cadets filed lawsuits alleging long-lasting trauma from their time at the Forge, Helgeson took aim at the school's public critics, whom he alleged were, quote, weakening the brand. While the military's conception of masculinity has thoroughly leaked into America's cultural groundwater, it initially appeared to me that the well would soon run dry. In recent years, a slew of military schools have shut their doors, including Howe Military Academy in Indiana, which closed in 2019 after 135 years due to budget shortfalls and dwindling enrollment. A few years later, a Georgia military academy closed suddenly following a series of massive gang-related brawls among cadets, where numerous shanks and improvised weapons were found. Then another academy, this one in Wyoming, went dark without notice. In 2010, the New York Military Academy nearly closed. A band of school officials traveled to Manhattan to plead for a bailout from the Academy's most famous alumnus, Donald J. Trump. According to 2 attendees of the meeting, Trump became visibly irritated after a rogue parent pitched an ambitious $50 million plan to build a hotel at the Academy, along with a junior college. Then an alumnus spilled a Diet Coke on Trump's flashy carpet. Quote, "Trump was quite pissed off," one of the attendees recalled. And then Miss America came into the meeting and distracted everybody. And that was the end of the meeting. While it looked for a moment as if Trump's alma mater might shutter forever, it was purchased by figures connected to the Chinese Communist Party for $16 million a few years ago. They run the school to this day. The Forge's military high school closed, but its junior college remains open, and officials have announced plans to spin off the old high school into a charter school. The Forge has further fortified its future through a training partnership with the Pennsylvania National Guard, plus an NSA-certified cybersecurity program and a gestating drone pilot initiative. In October 2025, the Forge became the first signatory to President Trump's, quote, Compact for Higher Education Excellence, which demands, among other things, that participants ban affirmative action and crack down on programs that punish, belittle, or, quote, spark violence against conservative ideas. 3 months later, in January 2026, the feds issued a $1 million grant to the Forge. It tasked the troubled academy with developing accreditation standards for military schools across America. Valley Forge has also exported its brand overseas through a satellite campus in Qatar that exposes its punitive practices on an even younger cohort, elementary school kids. A sign that even after perilous battlefield defeats in the Middle East, the image of the upstanding American military officer remains attractive on the world stage. The deeper I have looked, the more evidence I have discovered that military education is not a dying, outmoded brand, but a generously resourced, always and forever force in shaping the American man. Its resilient influence is evident by the dozens of military schools dotting the American landscape and by the powerful institutions that alumni control. 4 US presidents, including Trump, have attended military schools, as have many Fortune 500 CEOs, dozens of lawmakers, and top figures in the Defense Department, America's largest employer. So, as if that passage was not clear enough, the book essentially is focusing in on military education, which I have sort of widely defined as including service academies that are congressionally chartered, like West Point, the Air Force Academy, the Naval Academy, ROTC and JROTC, which encompass 5,200 units in public high schools and colleges across America, the Boy Scouts, the Young Marines, other sort of youth military programs, the Civil Air Patrol, and then this sort of amalgamation of military style schools, most of which have some path to entering the force, but which were sort of set up largely as the early iterations of like the troubled teen system, you know, like historically, if you had a child who was misbehaving or having trouble with the law or whatever else, you sort of shunted him to military academy. And really, you know, while this network is large and very influential, I chose to focus on these places for a few reasons, but the biggest one of which is that it's here where you can actually see the pedagogy of the military at its strongest. You know, there is a curriculum, there are courses, young, historically, boys are placed in these environments for many years, and so you can really see through those stories and through that history how these ideas shape boys into men in a way that's not always as clear with people who were drafted or were enlisted and only spent a few years in the service maybe. The thesis of the book is pretty harsh. There are, throughout the book, things I focus on that are sunnier, cheerier, lighter, funny. I said funny, I won't say it again. But it is funny, I promise. It's not super dark all the time. And really what I argue is that, you know, for boys such as myself who never even considered military service, there was still some sort of latent influence, military influence on how I conceived of my own masculinity. And I trace that back to the foundation of this country, the founding fathers, George Washington being chief among them, who, you know, at their core, most of them were Revolutionary War veterans. This country was founded on a great paradox wherein early Americans were at once very skeptical of standing armies and very resentful of the military occupation that they had endured from the British, but also saw very clearly that the route to freedom and democracy was military force. And you know, the lionization of figures like Washington, despite some of his efforts to brush those aside and remain, you know, a public servant, not a king, fused these ideas very powerfully. You know, military leadership on the world stage, citizenship, manhood. And those have really played out ever since then. They've evolved and mutated as, you know, depending on the conflict and the military technology at hand. This book basically traces the evolution of that masculinity from the Revolutionary War to today. And fundamental to the book is just the question, why do boys serve in the military? What is it that they're seeking? And there's a million different answers to that question. Many of them are economic reasons. the GI Bill, sort of military service is the last path to the middle class in this country. But then there's a lot of, really big ideas that motivate young boys to join the service, and young girls today too. Certainly, public service chief among them, I would say. There is often a sort of embedded motivation to secure some masculine validation. A lot of boys are also looking for community, solidarity, an identity. They're running from something often. And so I found with this book that it not only offered a sort of way to tell a different people's history of the US military, but to really sort of understand what boys are searching for, what they want, how their energy is channeled in positive and negative ways, and what they get out of their military service, both good and bad. So West Point is a major character in this book. West Point was the first military academy, started off as a strategic post during the Revolutionary War, and became the first sort of elite officer training program in the early 1800s, and is sort of where all other military educational programs have looked to sort of build a curriculum, create an honor code, establish initiation rites, and the like. Sort of one of the, I spoke to hundreds of former cadets at these places, administrators, alumni, teachers, and, et cetera. And, at the end of the day, a major reason why boys join the military historically is to find a girl. That has sort of always been a major allure. There's all of these old propaganda posters and newsreels from the World War II era of girls, completely smitten by the uniform. And so what I'm gonna talk a little bit about now is the West Point Cadet Hostess Office, which historically was an office on West Point's campus. West Point, by the way, is in upstate New York on the Hudson, if you didn't know. Staffed mostly by military wives who made it their mission to sort of drill into young cadets manners. They taught them how to foxtrot, how to hold a cup of tea, and they also arranged dates for cadets and, kind of paired them. This is a photo on the right of Douglas MacArthur's mother, who famously, when young Doug went to West Point in the 1800s, the legend goes that, she was definitely like a helicopter parent before that term existed. She rented a hotel room at the West Point Hotel that allowed her to see into her son's room and would watch him eagle-eyed all of the time to make sure that he was following the rules and acting like a good boy. So here's her seemingly scolding a much bigger cadet than her for perhaps some offense. This dynamic is interestingly, it's well illustrated by the relationship between West Point and Vassar. So historically, West Point, up until 1976, was all male. There is a chapter in the book about the integration of women into West Point, which is very harrowing. It's called The Last Class with Balls, which is what the last West Point men called themselves, and they had that acronym inscribed on their class rings. They either went by The Last Class with Balls or The Last Class Without Bitches. Those women endured a lot of abuse. But historically, because West Point was on one side of the Hudson and all male, Vassar was on the other side and all female, there was a lot of dating going on and social courtship and the like. This is a photo from 1943 of a bunch of Vassar girls at a dance with a bunch of Vassar boys. Let me just quickly open up my, okay. So yeah, and as part of book research, I found many wedding notices from mostly the 30s, 40s, and 50s in local newspapers of, young Vassar girls marrying West Pointers. Interestingly enough, David Petraeus, the famous general who architects the surges in Iraq and Afghanistan, he married the daughter of his superintendent, William Knowlton, who was this hard-charging son-of-a-bitch general from Vietnam. And there's actually this really interesting history I explore where a young Petraeus as a West Point cadet sort of sat on the knee of William Knowlton, the man whose daughter he would marry, as a West Pointer, and just learned all of the wrong lessons about Vietnam and then completely replicated them in Iraq and Afghanistan. Which is another big problem with these places is, people like David Petraeus, a young, smart, promising boy, enters West Point at the end of Vietnam and is there with a bunch of West Pointers who often are very defensive about their war and often aren't willing to fully reckon with it. And so, people like William Westmoreland, David Petraeus, they instill the wrong lessons about those failures and propel further ones. But anyways, there's something really interesting that happens. There's really a breakage during Vietnam between Vassar and there's a breakage between West Point and Vassar during Vietnam. And again, up until this point, really, a young West Point boy was kind of the pinnacle of the pinnacle. Being a soldier was sort of the best you could do. It was believed to sort of attract women, to be considered exemplar in your community, to get in the paper, to bask in universal acclaim, all of the rest. West Point cadets used to don their uniforms and go to Manhattan on the weekends, where almost certainly they would be guaranteed free drinks, often free hotel rooms. Really the power of the uniform in the first half of the 20th century was difficult to overstate. But then Vietnam happens, and that West Point's reputation changes. Let me see if this will actually work. It doesn't seem like it's going to, so I might have to. Oh wait, there it is. Okay. So, I also just want to say, what do I want to say? Okay. Yes. All right. I said that they learned how to dance the foxtrot. I'm glad I covered that crucial point. Okay. So yeah, just to sort of really hit home the point, Vassar would essentially more or less shut down on weekends, and the girls would sort of go to West Point, Princeton, Williams, other schools. And every girl who was brought in, let's say a Vassar girl was brought in by the West Point Cadet Office to be on West Point's campus, they would be handed what was called a lady's handbook to West Point. And one of the this is a quote from one of the, actually I'm not gonna read that, that's fine. Okay, so I'll just go back to Vietnam. So this is called Blood and Fire. This was a short-lived publication that Vassar girls produced against the war. They organized buses to major anti-war marches, the moratorium to end the war, etc. One edition encouraged students to travel down to New Jersey for a demonstration at Fort Dix, protesting the war. Okay. So there's also an interesting quote I found. An early Vassar girl was quoted about a West Point boy saying, "Oh, I pressed that. I'm sorry." Now we're breaking down into the crazy part of this. All right. She said that she liked West Point boys because they were neater and stand up straighter than most boys. But then another Vassar girl, sort of during this Vietnam War period, she warned in this newspaper, she said, "West Point boys are so starved for girls that when they get you alone, watch out," which I think actually powerfully pretends a lot of the issues of military sexual assault that have plagued West Point and other schools. Okay. culminating, October 1969, 200 Vassar students congregated at West Point's gates, where they handed out flowers to cadets and urged them to abandon their commissions. Some cadets snatched their flowers and ate them. Another sarcastically told a protester that he couldn't speak because he was on his way to, quote, poison gas class. A third, boyish-looking senior vented to the New York Times that the anti-war movement, quote, makes you wonder why the hell you should go risk your neck for those kind of people. This deep sense of grievance is immortalized in West Point's chapel, which traditionally offers each graduating class a personalized glass pane. When it came time for the class of 1966 to design their sheet, they landed on a depiction of Saint Valeria, who was tortured and beheaded by her own people. So what you see here, I think, is a major shift, because the West Point boys become resentful of the public, and this big idea in which troops in general and West Point officers in particular, who are the cream of the crop, are supposed to be loyal to their country, that shifts and it becomes more about loyalty to the institution, and a deep resentment around criticism from civilians emerges. Places like West Point become even more insular, and any sort of accountability or reckoning sort of evaporates entirely. And a lot of this, was just like simply related to the fact that on an interpersonal level, boys weren't able to, command a woman's attention as they once did. I mean, military masculinity is largely reliant on females being not only like profoundly reliant on, but deeply impressed by male strength. And the minute that sort of paradigm, that dynamic goes out the window, everything sort of starts to fall apart. Here's just a quote from one of the cadet hostesses at West Point describing this shift. Things were much different before William Westmoreland, who was a West Pointer who prosecuted Vietnam, left for Vietnam. Those liberal peaceniks from Smith and Vassar changed it all, you know. Protest signs and flowers, disrupting the Armed Forces Day Parade in New York City. The nerve of those girls. But the Corps handled it like heroes. Not one cadet flinched. They marched straight down 42nd Street while the girls stuffed daisies in their guns. Imagine that. I bet your cadet would do the same thing. So, interestingly enough, the West Point Cadet Hostess Office still exists to this day, which helps illustrate the very antiquated gender dynamics that still pervade the place. And I won't go through all of this, but it's still sort of a good example of what I trace in the book at places like West Point, which is sort of a sheen of respectability and grace and manners and intellect and morals, but beyond that, under the surface, there's a lot of ugliness festering. I argue largely because the entire institution is ultimately built on violence. But, you know, West Point in particular is a place, oh yeah, look at that guy. That's Pete Hegseth. West Point is a place where you know, that really has been hugely influential in sort of creating a public perception that there's an art of war, that there's such thing as a soldier scholar. And, you know, certainly throughout American history, there are some of those people who have thought very deeply about war, who have really aimed to avoid it. And some of these people, many of these people have gone through these schools. Many of the people who spoke to me for this book were people who were whip smart, tried to reform the place for the better, but found it very difficult, faced retaliation, you know, got in the way of political imperatives. So the book is not aimed to be a broadside against people who serve in the military. It's reliant almost exclusively on their voices and perspectives. But instead, it's hoping to provide a critique of a system that, in my opinion, has been allergic to any sort of criticism or reckoning in a real meaningful way for a very long time. And this has sort of culminated a lot of the history I trace and the currents I examine. It's all sort of perfectly embodied in Pete Hegseth, who has a rockin' body, but a brittle mind. So I'll probably just keep it with that. And if people have questions, they're welcome to ask them. And I thank you all for coming out on this hot night. So thank you. What did you say?
This is a lot different than your NPR.
A lot different than my NPR interview? Yeah, I couldn't. Well, I have a whole chapter in here called Strange Love, which is about all the weird homoerotic stuff that goes on in the military. So if you really want the R-rated version, you have to buy the book. Yes.
Were you harassed by any of the true believers? Were they threatened by your questions?
I mean, you know.
Finish the question, buddy.
Okay, the question was whether I've ever been like threatened or sort of faced, you know, verbal lashing by the military. Some of the people I've spoken to or tried to speak with. Well, I mean, I tried my damnedest to get in touch with and interview sort of as many people from all walks of life as I could. I mean, there's a lot of people that are very loyal to West Point in particular. And West Point is sort of its own clique or cartel within the military that wields incredible power. Often it's referred to as the West Point Protective Association, the West Point Mafia. People less charitably refer to it as the South Hudson Institute of Technology, whose acronym is SHIT. There's actually really interesting survey data and research into the difference between people who go to places like West Point, which are very insular and self-aggrandizing, and ROTC. I didn't really talk much about ROTC today, but ROTC was actually established, its predecessor was established by Justin Morrill, who was a Vermont congressman. During the Civil War, when the land-grant colleges and universities were established by Morrill, an act that Morrill wrote, there was a carve-out there that mandated some sort of military science offering. That became ROTC. And ROTC is not perfect by any means, but an ROTC cadet is in a liberal arts environment, and they are studying alongside civilians. So typically, they have a much more holistic view of the world and are often much smarter about what to do, how to lead, how to think problems through. I mean, places like West Point focus almost exclusively on STEM, hard subjects, and there's been efforts for a long time by very smart military people to inject poetry in the humanities and English and all of these things, but that has not generally happened. There's a little anecdote in the book as a sort of sign of disrespect that once, I think during Vietnam, the school appointed a civilian as an English professor, and the sort of like signage for their parking space misspelled professor, like as I think a dig or something. Anyways, any West Point, any ROTC person I want to speak to, they'll speak to me. They you know, including like really senior military guys, they have an openness to dialogue and engagement and criticism and can talk things through. The West Point guys, I mean, the sort of highest I got was Robert Gates, who ran the CIA for a while, ran the Defense Department, and then served as, he ran Texas A&M University for a while too. So I was like, okay, well here's a guy, here's a real soldier scholar, like I bet he'll think interestingly about this. But you then get him in a room, and it's just like, they just revert to these like rote anodyne talking points about, oh, I learned leadership, but you know, it's all about duty and country. And it's like, you can't push, you know, I mean, I'm sure that they have a critique there. Part of the problem though is how these systems operate is you have to, part of rising through the ranks is just being kind of a yes man and, you know, looking the other way and sort of, it doesn't encourage, you know, the system doesn't encourage intellectual rigor. It's very hard, for instance, for an officer to get a PhD. I've talked to people who have explained all of the intricacies of just trying to get a PhD and get the time off from the military. Really smart people who want to get a PhD, and they just, the Army and other branches just won't let it happen. So there's just, honestly, like, it's been really hard to find a lot of intellectual heft, people who will, I barely know what an AK-47 is. Like, there is so much I am ignorant about with the military. Someone could easily best me, and also I'm not a historian. Like, I am open to an alternative story here, and I've been looking for one, but I just can't really find it. I mean, the closest thing I thought I had was this guy Pat Ryan, who's the first West Pointer to represent his alma mater in Congress. He's a Democrat. He's done events with AOC, blah, 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 blah. And I tried to talk to him for 2 years, and he wouldn't talk to me. I even cornered him at an event at West Point and was like, hey, here's what I want to do. Here's my thing, blah, 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 blah. And he was like, oh, yeah, I'll talk to you. I promise I'll talk to you. I promise, I'll talk to you. And then, like, a week later, I got a call from the Secret Service who were at my door in Peacham, and I was the subject of a Secret Service investigation. Not saying it was him, but, like, you know, it's like, and West Point itself has been completely stonewalled me. They sicked the Secret Service on me last year. So they just really haven't engaged. And then, like, beyond that is just people online who, like, maybe served in the military or whatever, and just, you know, call me, like, soft or low testosterone, or, you know, just, like, insult me. But nothing really, I don't know, yeah, nothing crazy. Yes?
Bring up this question, which is, to what extent, if any, did the mention of the Christian right intersection with the military culture in those establishments come up?
Yes. A chapter in the book called Cadets for Christ, which talks about the long history of fusing military and Christian nationalist principles. I mean, you can find fire and brimstone sermons at West Point dating back to the 1800s. I mean, there's a lot of overlap if you sort of warp the Bible the right way between, you know, military service and Christian ideology. And certainly, you know, the military understood has long understood, many militaries have understood that, you know, offering the promise of an afterlife filled with beauty and riches, you know, helps push a guy into, you know, onto the beaches of Normandy or whatever. So it's long sort of played this role as both sort of like motivating behavior and also imbuing the mission with a divine element, which has become increasingly necessary as American conflict has lost a moral center. You know, this wasn't as necessary in World War II, where we were fighting fascism, but in Vietnam, in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, Christian nationalism has played a more central role. And I mean, there's a lot to talk about there, and I'll try not to be too long-winded. There was a moment, however, the dropping of the atomic bomb was this insane feat of violence, and it imbued a lot of early Air Force fighter pilots with a sense of sort of divine power. I mean, you know, they were up in the clouds, you know, controlling the world. They were masters of the world. And shortly after World War II ended, the Air Force was chartered as its own service branch, and the U.S. Air Force Academy was chartered alongside with it. This was the first of the service academies to sort of eschew the waspiness of the East Coast, and it was established in Colorado Springs, Colorado, which is a haven of evangelical megachurches and proselytizing. And the Air Force Academy has long, since its foundation, and the Air Force more broadly, has long been a bastion of white evangelical power. And there's a number of other forces that sort of play into this, including the fact that during Vietnam, a lot of mainline Protestant chaplains in the military chaplaincy opposed Vietnam and left on that opposition, and in came many evangelicals and Christian, conservative Christian chaplains. And then of course 9/11 happens. 4 days after those attacks, Bush describes the coming conflict as a crusade. Many senior military leaders did as well, including Donald Rumsfeld. And that's the world that Pete Hegseth was formed in. You know, he arrived at Princeton ROTC in 2000 with a very fragile ego and a lot of energy. And so he sort of, identifies very early on as a neocon and really frames the war in explicitly religious terms. He obviously has crusade tattoos today. And there's a really interesting passage in one of his books where he blames our losses in Iraq and Afghanistan partially on the fact that the force was insufficiently pious, that there wasn't a sort of religious verve that could match, Islamic extremism. And he even goes as far as to describe an image of this ISIS fighter like on top of a Jeep after a firefight, and speaks sort of fawningly about this man and the fact that, his religion was driving him so passionately to fight, and sort of bemoans the fact that the American soldier today is not sort of captured by the same religious intensity. And I mean, he's doing a million different things to try to reshape the Pentagon, including by injecting even more Christian nationalism inside it. Any other questions? Yes.
So, West Point obviously has a lot of alumni who go, serve, and so some must come back with PTSD and issues. Do they recognize that there? Do they have any services for them? How do they handle that?
Yeah, that's a good question. The question was about West Pointers and military school graduates who have PTSD. I mean, the fact of the matter is that the hazing rates at these places, up until today, even though the schools continue to downplay their severity, can cause PTSD in and of themselves. The initial inculcation rites, which at some schools are called indoctrination. I mean, there was something very cultish about it: shaving your head, giving everyone the same uniform, cutting them off from their families, beating them down, stripping them of their identities, blah, 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 blah. It can be very, especially if you're fragile to begin with, it can be really devastating. Yes, and PTSD has long been stigmatized at these places. I think they've done a better job in recent years of being open. But the last time I checked, West Point and the military, I mean, there are a banned number of prescription drugs for depression and other mental health issues. So, I mean, that is a stigma in and of itself. The fact that, if you want to serve in the military, you better not be relying on pharmacology pussy, So that's that still exists. And there's a tragic story I write about in the book of a young cadet at Valley Forge who really wanted to go to West Point in middle school. And it was his dream to go to West Point, but he knew that if he wanted to go to West Point, he had to get off his prescription drugs. He could not be on depression medication anymore. So at some point, he gets off that medication without telling anyone. And not long after, I mentioned him in the introduction, Kerry LeCamp, he kills himself. So, another, I'm not trying, I have talked to so many vets and people who've been in this space, and it's the culture that I am criticizing. I hope that is clear. It is not the people. The people often very much more than many Americans, people who enter the military are committed to this country's ideals in a pure way that are difficult to fathom and are really admirable to see. They have a very positive energy. They are very smart. They are very motivated. But often that energy is just channeled into self-destructive aims. But yeah, I mean, it's, and there's a lot of stories like that, you know, people who are really ground down. I mean, there's another guy I profile in the book who went to West Point, was on the football team, suffered intense physical and sexual abuse on the football team, has really bad PTSD, never recovered. 30 years later, he's in prison for the rest of his life because he lives in Florida, which has a 3 strikes law. And because he, like, you know, got caught stealing a couple times, he's in prison for the rest of his life and is a really great guy, but was never able to recover from what he experienced at West Point. Yes?
I want to thank you for writing this book. And as a man, I want to thank you for shedding light on the contribution of the military and the crisis of masculinity in this culture. That said, I'm kind of curious as to if you have any thoughts about Graham Plattner's campaign over in Maine. Not so much his campaign, but more about his evolution of his own masculinity.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the very kind comments. The question was about Graham Plattner, and I know it's getting late. This may be the last. If people want to talk to me afterwards, they can, but I know it's hot. The question was about Graham Plattner, who I just had a 45-minute conversation with him right before I got here. And, you know, first of all, I mean, I think one of the redeeming, if sort of complicated elements of military life that is really beautiful is sort of like brotherly love and connection and community and, you know, looking out for one another and all of that stuff. Like, men in these environments often build really deep bonds, and there's a kind of strange permission structure because the military is so like hyper masculine that if you're actually in it and your sort of heterosexuality is maybe harder to question, you can kind of like engage in more sensitive, soft love in moments. And so there's actually like a lot of really beautiful stories of that happening in the military, strangely enough. And Graham experienced a lot of that as well. I mean, when you talk to him, that is what sticks with him. But, you know, I mean, Graham Plattner's campaign is fascinating for a number of reasons. But first and foremost, you know, what it is doing is challenging this country's purported grace and empathy for veterans in a real way. Because most of the people who run for office or who are in public life who have served, most of them are officers, people who went to West Point and the like. Often they come from very privileged backgrounds. Some of them have been through really tough stuff, but often for political purposes they minimize that. Or, you know, most officers are kept away from the worst experiences of war. They're the ones sort of, you know, gaming the battle plans. Again, some of them go through really rough stuff, but Graham Plattner enlisted in the Marines as a machine gunner in the infantry. I think a lot of people don't fully reckon with what that entails and what that entailed in his case. 4 deployments. He landed in Iraq in 2005 at Abu Ghraib prison. Is there a darker place you could go as a 19-year-old? Imagine your 19-year-old boy landing at Abu Ghraib prison in 2005. And, you know, he saw a lot. He experienced a lot. And, you know, there was, because I was talking about this online a few days ago, and I was saying, what we need to do here is understand that his past misdeeds and not absolve him of that necessarily. There is a level of personal accountability here. But at the same time, every single thing Graham Plattner has struggled with are part and parcel of endemic, you know, military struggles. Severe drinking. The military has the highest divorce rate of any career field. Military service is today the #1 predictor of violent extremism in America. The title of my book is God Forgives Brothers Don't. which originated as the Omerta Code of the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas, a neo-Nazi prison gang, before it became the West Point football team motto. Why? I don't know. It's a good question. So, and I say that because Plattner had this Totenkampf tattoo. It was skull and crossbones that is associated with the SS and the Nazis. But far-right ideologies and authoritarianism are, unfortunately, overlap with a lot of military culture. It's just the fact. It is an authoritarian structure. And, you know, I mean, I also talked to someone for this piece that I'm writing who said that they saw that exact skull and crossbones tattoo at tattoo shops all around Camp Lejeune, which is a big Marine base, which I don't think has been reported yet, but like, it just speaks again to like, if you're just gonna be drenched in a culture of violence, you're going to go into dark places. And again, so like the question with Graham Plattner is, can this country extend someone grace who has been deeply damaged by his military service? Are we able to do that? Or is this all kind of performative? Is it just a way to sort of abstract violence and wash away our own complicity? Or is this country actually willing to understand the blowback that so many men like Graham Plattner represent from, you know, 2.5 decades of war? So I think we should just wrap it up there because it's hot. But I really appreciate you all coming. If people want to ask me questions, I'm happy to talk. And I thank you all for coming out and listening to me. Buy the book.